Welcome to Unit 13 for Anatomy and Physiology students, where we're going to cover the chapter on the central nervous system in the lab manual. Now, in this chapter, the author focuses both on the brain and the spinal cord, which are the two main parts of the central nervous system. But for this lab, we're going to primarily focus on the parts and anatomy and function of the brain itself. And we want to see where the brain is located, what are the different structures of the brain, how do they relate and connect to each other, and we essentially want to have a good kind of gross anatomical overview of this very important area for the body. Now, the brain is the most complex organ in the body, with over 86 billion neurons that have been counted, and with many more synapses and support cells inside to allow the brain to function properly, to allow for communication and control over pretty much all the processes in the body. Now, when we're talking about the brain, we're essentially visualizing the cerebral cortex, the cerebrum, right? That's the main portion of the brain that goes from the front to the back. The deeper portion, which is the midbrain and the brainstem, and the smaller area all the way in the back, which is the cerebellum. After I discuss these separate areas, we're also going to talk about simply how the brain is kind of supported, how it's protected, which involves obviously the cranium, the skull, the skin, and the underlying structures together with the cerebrospinal fluid. Now, before we get into those, let's talk about the basics of the anatomy of the brain itself. Now, when you're going to be looking at the illustrations in the book or online, you're going to see that the cerebral cortex consists of, first of all, there's the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere, right? It's separated by the longitudinal fissure. So if you were to cut the brain in half in autopsy, you would see that it's split into right and left halves. So now putting the brain together, we see there's a frontal lobe to the cerebral cortex, there's parietal lobes, temporal lobes, and occipital lobes. These are the primary large areas of the cerebral cortex. The frontal lobes are the most developed in humans, in us. So these are responsible for higher level functions like the executive functions of reasoning, problem solving, your personality, and also allows you to have motor control. So essentially, when you're thinking of controlling all your musculoskeletal systems, you are doing this from your frontal lobes, so the information goes from the neurons from this part of the brain to all your muscles, essentially. And this area also is known to process language. Specifically, the Broca's area in the left frontal lobe processes speech information, specifically the production of speech. Okay, so language processing happens in multiple parts of the brain. In the Broca's area in the left frontal lobe, this is where we allow for the production of speech, and that kind of processing to occur. Now, when you're thinking of the parietal lobes, again, these are kind of further back, more posterior to the frontal lobes. This is a large area, has multiple different kind of processes taking place there, but the most important one is thinking about sensory control, sensory input processing, so those related to especially touch and other kind of sensory inputs are sort of intermingle and connect there and are processed. Parietal lobes are also known to process attention-related information and also other somatosensory perceptions. Occipital lobes all the way in the back, kind of thinking about like the occipital bones, right, from the skull, occipital lobes, occipital area. This is primary visual cortex, so all the eyesight, all the vision information coming from your eyes, from the optic nerves, goes all the way back to the occipital lobes and is processed there. And on the sides, the temporal lobes closest to the ears, as it makes sense, right, based on the location, they actually process the auditory and visual stimuli, so hearing and balance information is processed there. And also part of the temporal lobe also is involved with language processing, specifically understanding of speech in this area called the Wernicke's area. Wernicke's area is this small area in the left temporal lobe that deals with language, just like Broca's area did in the frontal lobe. And in this case, it's dealing with understanding of speech. So when someone is speaking to you and you are able to understand the words they're using and what they're saying, it's because you are using the neurons and the processing in this part of the brain. Now, going over to deeper structures, so sort of deeper to the cerebral cortex, we have the midbrain and the brainstem. Finally, that's the portion that eventually leads to the beginnings of the spinal cord, which extends out from the spinal column. So the midbrain is a large area. There's a lot of different very critical, very important primitive sort of level functions. So we have the thalamus. This is the kind of oval area we have in the midbrain. This is the relay center for all connections going from the cerebral cortex downward, and all the connections coming from the lower portion up from the spinal cord towards the cerebral cortex. They have to pass through the thalamus, and thalamus is able to kind of interrupt these connections or decide whether the signal will proceed up or down through those relays. Another similar area is called the pons. This is again another kind of oval area right next to the brainstem, lower in that kind of section of the brain. And the pons also has basically the long fiber tracts that connect going from the spinal cord to other deeper, higher up areas in the brain, and sort of have that again another opportunity to make connections and perhaps alter the path of the signal. We have the medulla, right, also often called medulla oblongata. This is the area inside the brainstem, very small area. Most important to us is the nucleus of the solitary tract. This part of the medulla deals with the control of the cardiovascular and the respiratory systems, and is therefore extremely important to the normal functioning of the body, obviously. And so again, it's called the nucleus of the solitary tract, present inside the medulla in the brainstem, controlling cardiovascular and respiratory functions. So things like rate of breathing, control of the rhythm of the heart, and so on. Another interesting area is the optic chiasm. This is the crossing of the optic fibers. So each optic nerve is sent from the eyes towards the occipital lobe, but they actually cross fibers at the optic chiasm. This is right near the pituitary gland, deep in the brain, kind of in this midbrain area, as I'm mentioning. So you'll see in the book and the pictures, basically the crossing of the optic fibers. So again, it's called an optic chiasm. And another important area here that is not just simply anatomical, but actually functionally significant, is we're going to mention something called the limbic system. This is the system that deals with memory processing. So when you're thinking of limbic system, you're thinking multiple areas in the brain, not necessarily all located in the same exact location, but all of these structures named here, like the hippocampus, amygdala, cingulate gyrus, and the mammillary bodies, among others, all deal to some extent with acquisition and storage and processing of memories. Hippocampus specifically deals with processing of long-term memories. Amygdala deals with processing of memories that deal with emotion. So emotional connections to memory, fear expressed through memories, things like that. By the way, both the hippocampus and amygdala are located deep inside the temporal lobes. And cingulate gyrus, which is located kind of in the inner sort of cortex area above the corpus callosum, which I'm going to get to soon. This area again also actually deals with autonomic nervous system and processing of memories. And the last portion, the smaller of these, is the mammillary bodies. These two little bumps that are located close to the optic chiasm, they also play a role that we have now known for some time in processing of memory and memory-related information in the brain. Again, limbic system processing memory and in the brain. Now, I mentioned the corpus callosum. These are the white matter tracts in the brain connecting the right and left hemispheres, basically like a bridge that allows fast communication between the right and left hemispheres. The corpus callosum is usually cut when we're cutting through the longitudinal fissure to separate the right and left hemispheres of the brain in autopsy. When we talk about the white matter, we also talk about gray matter. White matter, keep in mind, is the myelinated tracts, and the gray matter is the non-myelinated axons in the brain. Right, so when you're looking at the brain, usually the outer kind of cortex is gray matter, the deeper areas is white matter. In the spinal cord, it's reversed. And the white matter is on the outside, the gray matter is inside. And the last portion here is the cerebellum. Cerebellum usually appears as a much smaller area, kind of right underneath the occipital lobes. This area primarily deals with, has its unique kind of set of neurons and connections, and mostly is involved with coordination of movement, coordination of balance, and kind of making sure that movement occurs with precision and accuracy. Again, for all of these areas, make sure to look at illustrations in the book to see what the brain looks like from different angles, and keep in mind also how the brain is actually protected and supported. So the next page, you're going to see sort of what is the primary way that the brain will be assisted in its function. So when we're thinking of the skull as protecting the brain, right? So going from the outside, we have the skin. When you remove the skin, you have the skull. When you remove the skull, you see the protective coverings or the meninges on top of the brain. The meninges consist of 3 layers. The toughest one, the first layer on the top, is the dura mater. Underneath is the arachnoid mater. And the deepest layer that's adherent to, or basically always connected directly to the cortex itself, is the pia mater. So we have dura, arachnoid, and pia mater. These are the protective coverings, the meninges. If you ever heard of meningitis or inflammation, infection of the brain, that's a very common, very serious disorder. It's referring to the inflammation of these coverings. When you finally remove the meninges, right, you get to see the brain itself. Again, keep in mind the brain is constantly bathed, is protected by the cerebrospinal fluid, the CSF. The cerebrospinal fluid is a way to remove waste from the brain, waste generated by the cellular processes from the neurons, protect the brain, kind of like the amniotic fluid was protecting the baby during gestation in the woman, in the uterus. In a similar way, the CSF constantly surrounds the brain to protect it, to reduce impact in case any kind of injury occurs to the head. The brain does not hit against the skull to cause severe injury. It's constantly is protected, it's cushioned by this liquid. Now, obviously, that does not mean the brain cannot receive injury. It just means that overall, under normal conditions, normal physiological state, the CSF does an enormous job of protecting the brain, and without it, the brain would not be able to survive within the skull. Now, the CSF is a liquid that we can see during a lumbar puncture. Remember, lumbar puncture is a procedure where you insert a needle between the L4 and 5 lumbar vertebra and kind of withdraw some of that liquid. The needle needs to be placed into the subarachnoid space. And when you get this liquid, you can put it under the microscope. You can see that it's a mostly transparent liquid that has a few proteins and some level of sugar, a few cells there. It should not have blood. It should not have excess amount of proteins or sugar in it. And it definitely should be primarily sterile. It should not have any organisms growing in it, as that might indicate some kind of a inflammatory or infectious process, again, like meningitis that I mentioned before. So the CSF obviously is mostly water, mostly liquid, so it's coming from the bloodstream. In order to generate CSF, choroid plexus, which is a special collection of those ependymal cells we talked about in the brain ventricles, like the lateral ventricles and other ventricles of the brain, they help to produce the CSF, and eventually it needs to be sort of recycled to drained out, and this is done through the arachnoid granulations. Again, choroid plexus helps to produce CSF, and to drain out the CSF is done through the arachnoid granulations. Again, make sure to see in the book where the brain ventricles are located. They are in this chapter, Unit 13, and see sort of how this takes place. They show you kind of through the arrows, the drainage, and the movement of the fluid. And hopefully this gives you a better understanding of how this works. Again, review this information in the book, and definitely follow the anatomical models to see all the parts of the brain and what they're doing, what their function is.